Hey, random people out there on the internet. If you've been watching my videos, remember I cut this into a manageable strip or a manageable piece so that I could cut out some of the bowing and the warping and whatnot, and then ran it through my table saw to get it nice and straight and get the edges all cleaned up. So in that video I did mention I'm going to cut this into strips and make a birdhouse. So I'm going to be doing that with my table saw and something known as a thin rip jig. Let's take a look at that. So here we are at the table saw. You always want to remember to have something to hold the wood down. You don't want it to be picked up at any time. As you pass it through, in this case, it slides through. It's a little bit sticky on this end. There we go. You want it to be able to pass freely that way, but you don't want it to pass backwards. So we got that going. The next thing we want to do is put our thin rib jig on. This is a thin rib jig. If you'll notice, it has a little wheel here, and then this mechanism slides. You can put that in your track, bring it over to just in front of the blade. Now we want to move our fence over so that we get the thickness of the rip that we want, and I'm thinking about 3/8 inch. So I'm going to move it over until it's that's about 3/8 of an inch right there. Lock our fence down. Now we're going to push the jig up against the board thusly and tighten it down. So what will happen is it'll roll along that wheel, and the piece that we want is going to be on this side of the blade, which is a little bit different than what you may have seen in the past. And actually, looking at this board, I think I'm just going to go ahead and rip a little bit of it off because it's trying to bump right there. So I'm going to do that first. I just want to rip the edge right off of it. Nothing special. Like I said, it's got a little bump going right there where that knot is. Get some ear protection, turn on my vacuum cleaner, and we'll run it through there one time. My thin rip jig won't quite contact the wood cutting that small of a strip. So I'm going to go ahead and get my feather board and put on there. I'm going to do this to get that edge straightened up a little bit before I cut the strips. We got a nice straight edge. We're going to put that edge up against the fence. Swap out our feather board with our thin rip jig again and set it to 3/8 inches again. Yeah, it's about 3/8. And you see this knot right here? We're going to talk about that after everything's done. Alright, so if I did everything right, the last piece is probably a little different than the rest, but the rest of these should probably all be just about the same. Now, you may have noticed I flipped one over to what's going on here. Alright, you'll see that they're not pushed together very well because as the wood passed through, it crowned and it twisted and it bowed. I expected that. What happens is that there's tension stored up in the wood. In this case, you can barely see it. There's just a little warp right there. But if you look at some of these others that are more drastic, you can see there is a significant bow in that piece. The reasoning is, again, as you release the tension that's in the wood, it's going to go into its own natural shape, and typically what will cause this are knots or irregular grain, and you see what you get. Now, I expected that, and you can see it crowned a little bit and it bowed a little bit. So the takeaway here, it's not going to make that much difference for the project I'm going to work on, because I'm going to be cutting these into shorter lengths, and after I cut them, then I'll be able to put them together, glue them together, so that I can make walls, the roof, the sides, and so forth, the bottom. I'll be making panels out of all these strips, and I'll be gluing them together for a birdhouse, but they're going to be cut so much shorter that these bows and everything aren't going to make a significant difference. On larger projects, it can be a significant problem. So there's no way to avoid it 100%. It all happens when you start shopping the wood. Now you remember that these had knots and all kinds of stuff going on there that caused us to have significant movement of the wood as it released the tension. This one, on the other hand, has a lot of very straight grain. It may twist and bow a little bit, but it won't be nearly what we saw here, because until it gets to these knots, there's not as much tension built up in a nice straight grain. So when you're shopping for your wood, if you're going to the Home Depot, it can be very difficult to find a board at a Home Depot or a Lowe's. Not picking on Home Depot, pretty much any home center, it's going to be significantly more difficult to find a board that doesn't have a lot of knots or a lot of grain movement and so forth. That's the reason that most really professional woodworkers use hardwood, because it is less prone to moving and bowing and twisting. And they always make sure that the wood is dried out significantly, the moisture content down to around 7%, so that whatever movement does occur is going to be very minute. So that gives you an idea how you can use a thin rip jig to rip thin strips for projects. In upcoming videos, we'll be starting this birdhouse, and we'll go ahead and share that with you as we go along. In the meantime, I do appreciate all your subscriptions, your comments, and your shares. And as always, be safe.